The most convincing lies are the ones that make the truth sound insane. That was exactly what I believed on the rainy Tuesday afternoon when I first saw the woman everyone else refused to acknowledge. My name is Ethan Walker, and until that moment I thought my life was as ordinary as any other 35-year-old financial analyst living in Seattle. I had a stable career, a comfortable home, and a wife named Emily who had somehow made every difficult season of my life feel manageable. Nothing about that day suggested my world was about to split into two completely different versions of reality. My flight from Denver had landed nearly 40 minutes late because of bad weather, and by the time I collected my carry-on and reached the rideshare pickup area outside the terminal, the rain had become steady enough to blur the distant parking garage into a gray wall. Travelers hurried past me with rolling suitcases, families searched for relatives, drivers held handwritten signs, and everyone seemed focused on reaching the next destination, except for one woman standing alone beneath a flickering airport light. She wore a dark navy coat over a cream blouse, and although the rain dampened loose strands of her blonde hair, she made no effort to move under the nearby shelter. She simply watched people pass as though she was waiting for someone who had forgotten she existed. Several passengers glanced toward her before quickly looking away. One airport employee quietly asked if she needed assistance, but she smiled politely and shook her head. Two security officers exchanged brief looks before continuing their patrol. It felt as though everyone had already decided she was harmless, but slightly unstable. I probably would have reached the same conclusion if she had not suddenly looked directly at me. The moment our eyes met, her expression changed from quiet patience to unmistakable relief. Before I realized what was happening, she began walking toward me with calm, deliberate steps. I instinctively tightened my grip on my suitcase. She stopped a few feet away, careful not to invade my personal space. Her blue eyes studied my face as though confirming something she had hoped was still true. Then she smiled, not with excitement, but with the exhausted gratitude of someone who had spent years searching for a missing person. "You finally came back," she said softly. I frowned. "I think you have the wrong person." She shook her head almost immediately. "No, I have never been more certain of anything." I glanced around, expecting someone nearby to intervene or explain the misunderstanding, but everyone continued walking as though we were invisible. "Look," I said, trying to remain polite, "I do not know you." "I know," she answered. "That is why this is going to sound impossible." She reached into her handbag very slowly, and for a brief moment I wondered if she was about to hand me a business card or ask for directions. Instead, she removed a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. The metal looked old from years of use, yet it had been carefully polished. She held it in her open palm without offering it to me. "Your wife begged me never to find you," she whispered. Every muscle in my body tightened. "What did you just say?" She never looked away from my eyes. "Emily believed that if I disappeared forever, you would finally be happy." My heartbeat stumbled. Hearing my wife's name from the lips of a complete stranger was unsettling enough, but the calm certainty in her voice was even worse. I forced out an uneasy laugh, convinced I had encountered someone suffering from a dangerous delusion. "You need help?" I said quietly. "You have mistaken me for someone else." She lowered her eyes for only a second before looking back at me with heartbreaking patience. "I wish that were true," she replied. "Because if I had found the wrong man, I would not have to tell you what your wife has spent 6 years trying to hide." The rain continued falling around us, soft enough to blur the airport lights, but steady enough to keep most people moving without stopping. I should have walked away. Every reasonable instinct told me to leave, call my rideshare, and forget the strange woman forever. Instead, something about the confidence in her voice refused to let me take another step. "How do you know my wife?" I asked. She looked down at the old brass key resting in her palm before carefully slipping it back into her handbag. "Because she trusted me once," she answered. "Long before she hoped you would never see me again." I shook my head in disbelief. "Emily would have told me if she had a friend like you." A faint, almost sympathetic smile crossed her face. "No, she would not have." I folded my arms. "Then tell me your name." "Grace Morgan." The name meant absolutely nothing to me. I searched my memory, trying to connect it to a holiday gathering, a work event, a neighborhood barbecue, or even one of Emily's social media friends. Nothing. She might as well have introduced herself as a complete stranger because that was exactly what she was. I have never heard Emily mention you, I replied. That is because she removed every trace of me 6 years ago. I laughed uneasily. This conversation is becoming ridiculous. Grace remained completely calm. Does Emily still leave one kitchen cabinet completely empty? My smile disappeared. What? The cabinet above the coffee maker. She refuses to store anything inside because she says it reminds her to never fill every space in a home. My stomach tightened. It was true. I had teased Emily about that empty cabinet dozens of times. She always smiled and changed the subject instead of explaining why. I had never questioned it further. Grace continued before I could answer. She still sleeps closest to the bedroom door. My heartbeat quickened. She says it helps her sleep better because she can hear the hallway. That was true too. Emily had insisted on that side of the bed from the day we moved in together. I swallowed hard. Anyone could guess those things. Grace slowly nodded. Then let us try something no one could guess. Every Sunday morning your wife makes blueberry pancakes, even though she never eats more than half of one. She always places the extra pancake on the small blue plate with a chipped corner. She has kept that plate for years because she cannot bring herself to throw it away. I stared at her in complete silence. That plate had been in our kitchen since before we married. Emily once joked that it had survived 3 apartments and 2 moves. I never asked why she refused to replace it. Grace looked toward the rain-soaked parking lot before quietly adding, she still keeps a white envelope hidden inside the old sewing basket in the upstairs hallway closet. My breath caught. Emily did own an old sewing basket, although I had never opened it. What is inside? I asked. Grace met my eyes. I do not know anymore. She changed what was inside after everything happened. But I know exactly where she hid it because I watched her place it there. I took one uncertain step backward. Every answer she gave sounded impossible, yet every detail matched the life I shared with Emily. I searched Grace's face for any sign that she was inventing the story as she spoke, but her expression never changed. It was steady, patient, almost sorrowful. If you really know all of this, I whispered, then tell me why my wife erased you from her life. Grace hesitated for the first time since approaching me. Her eyes filled with quiet regret as she slowly reached into her handbag once more. This time she removed a small weathered wooden box no larger than a hardcover book and carefully placed it on top of my suitcase. Because, she said softly, this was the one thing she prayed you would never open. For several long seconds, I simply stared at the weathered wooden box resting on top of my suitcase, while the rain continued tapping softly against the concrete outside the terminal. It looked ordinary, almost disappointingly simple, with faded oak panels, worn brass corners, and tiny scratches left by years of careful handling. Nothing about it suggested that it contained anything capable of changing my life. Open it, Grace said quietly. I looked up at her. If this is some kind of joke, it is not funny. She slowly shook her head. I have waited 6 years for this moment. I would never joke about any of it. My fingers hesitated before lifting the small brass latch. The box opened without resistance. Inside, there was no money, no jewelry, and no dramatic confession. There was only an old silver key attached to a faded blue ribbon and a folded sheet of cream-colored paper. My name was written across the front in neat handwriting. Ethan. No last name. Just Ethan. Something about the handwriting felt strangely familiar, although I could not explain why. Read it, Grace whispered. I unfolded the paper carefully. The message was short. If you are holding this, then Grace had no other choice. Please forgive her before you judge her. Everything she tells you after today is the truth I asked her to protect. There was no signature. I turned the page over, hoping to find another sentence, but it was blank. My heart began beating faster. Emily wrote this? I asked. Grace looked down for a moment before answering. No. I frowned. Then who did? Instead of speaking, she reached into her handbag once again and removed a small envelope that had clearly aged with time. She handed it to me with both hands. Inside were 3 printed photographs. The first showed me standing outside a rustic cabin beside a quiet lake. I recognized my own face immediately, but I had absolutely no memory of ever visiting that place. The second photograph showed Emily standing beside me with her arm around my shoulders. We were both smiling naturally, dressed in casual weekend clothes as though we had spent the day together. The final photograph stopped me cold. Standing beside Emily and me was Grace. All three of us were laughing at something outside the frame. No one appeared uncomfortable. No one looked like strangers. We looked like people who genuinely trusted one another. I examined every detail, searching for signs of digital editing or manipulation, but the lighting, reflections, and shadows all appeared completely authentic. "This cannot be real," I whispered. "It is," Grace answered gently. "That picture was taken 7 years ago." My mouth felt dry. Why do I not remember any of this? Grace did not answer immediately. Instead, she pointed toward the silver key still resting inside the wooden box. "That key belongs to a storage room in Bellevue. You rented it under your own name almost 7 years ago. The payments have been made automatically every month ever since." I stared at her in disbelief. "I have never rented a storage unit." "You did," she replied softly. "You simply do not remember doing it." I reached for my wallet with trembling hands and pulled out my driver's license. The address was correct. Everything about my identity felt normal. Yet somehow this stranger continued producing evidence that fit together with impossible precision. "What is inside the storage room?" I finally asked. Grace's expression became even more solemn. "Your entire life before Emily convinced herself that forgetting would be the only way you could survive." My mind refused to accept the sentence, yet every instinct warned me that walking away would never erase what I had already seen. Then Grace quietly placed one final object into my hand. It was a laminated storage access card bearing my own photograph, my own signature, and an issue date from nearly 7 years earlier that I could not remember living. SUA, the storage access card felt heavier than a piece of laminated plastic should have. I turned it over several times, searching for some obvious sign that it had been forged, but every detail appeared genuine. My photograph matched my current appearance, my signature looked exactly like the one on my driver's license, and the issue date stared back at me with quiet certainty. 7 years ago. A period of my life I believed I remembered clearly. I looked up at Grace, hoping to find hesitation in her face, but all I saw was the weary patience of someone carrying a burden that no longer belonged to her. "If this is real," I said carefully, "why did you wait until now?" She looked toward the rain falling beyond the terminal before answering. "Because I promised your wife I would never contact you unless she broke her own promise first." My pulse quickened. "What promise?" Grace folded her hands together. "She promised she would tell you everything herself when the time was right." I frowned. "Then why are you here?" Grace met my eyes without hesitation. "Because 2 weeks ago I received a letter from Emily." Every sound around us seemed to fade into the background. "A letter?" I asked. Grace nodded. "She mailed it to me before disappearing for a few days. Inside, she wrote only one sentence. She said she could not carry the truth alone anymore, but she was afraid that if she told you herself, you would never believe her. She asked me to finish what all three of us started years ago." My thoughts raced. Emily had told me she was attending a professional training conference in Portland the previous week. She had called every evening, sounded completely normal, and never mentioned writing to anyone named Grace. "You are saying my wife lied to me." Grace lowered her eyes. "She hid the truth from you. There is a difference." I wanted to argue, but I could not ignore the photographs, the handwritten note, or the storage card in my pocket. Every impossible detail continued fitting together. My phone vibrated. Emily's smiling face appeared on the screen. I hesitated before answering. "Hi," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Did you make it home?" she asked warmly. "Not yet. The flight was delayed, and traffic is terrible." I listened carefully to every word she spoke, searching for some hidden sign that had always been there. "Do not forget that we promised to visit my parents this weekend," she said. "And please pick up blueberries tomorrow morning. I want to make pancakes." My grip tightened around the phone. "Blueberry pancakes." Grace quietly looked away, giving me privacy without leaving. "Everything is fine?" Emily asked after a brief silence. "Yes," I replied automatically. "Everything is fine." We ended the call, but the words felt hollow the moment they left my mouth. Grace waited until I slipped the phone back into my pocket. "She still says everything is fine whenever she is frightened," she whispered. "She has done that since before you married." I rubbed my forehead, trying to organize thoughts that refused to stay still. "If I drive to that storage facility and there is nothing there, this ends today." Grace gave a slow, understanding nod. "That is fair." "And if there is something?" I asked. She took a deep breath before answering. Then you will discover that your wife has never been hiding another life from you. She paused just long enough for my mind to prepare for another impossible revelation. She has been hiding yours. An hour later, I was driving through the wet evening traffic toward Bellevue with Grace following behind me in a silver sedan that looked almost as ordinary as everything I desperately wanted my life to become again. Neither of us spoke during the drive. Every few minutes I caught myself hoping the navigation would somehow lead to the wrong address or that the access card would fail when I reached the building. It would have been comforting to prove that every impossible claim had been built on coincidence and manipulation. Instead, the navigation guided me directly to a quiet storage facility tucked behind a row of office buildings. The front entrance was brightly lit, and a security camera slowly rotated above the automatic gate. I parked, stepped into the cool evening air, and walked toward the keypad with the access card still clutched in my hand. Grace remained several steps behind me. "If you want to leave," she said gently, "no one will stop you." I looked at the card one last time before sliding it through the reader. A green light flashed immediately. The gate unlocked with a soft click. My stomach dropped. We walked through narrow rows of storage units until we reached Building C. Unit 214. The number printed on the access card matched the number painted on the metal door. I stood there in complete silence. "You rented this place yourself?" Grace said quietly. "No one forged your signature. No one forced you." My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked the padlock with the silver key from the wooden box. The lock opened smoothly, as though it had been maintained with care. I slowly lifted the metal door. The overhead lights switched on automatically. The room was surprisingly neat. Plastic storage bins lined one wall. A wooden bookshelf stood against another. There was even a small desk covered by a clean gray cloth. Nothing looked abandoned. Nothing looked forgotten. It looked preserved. I stepped inside and noticed labels attached to nearly every container. Financial records, personal journals, family photos, medical documents, vacation videos. Each label was written in the same familiar handwriting I had seen on the folded note inside the wooden box. Grace remained near the entrance, allowing me to explore without interruption. I pulled a photo album from the nearest shelf and opened it slowly. Every page contained moments I could not remember living. Emily and I stood beside a lake during autumn. We celebrated birthdays with friends whose faces seemed strangely familiar but impossible to identify. We laughed around a backyard fire pit. We decorated a Christmas tree inside a house I did not recognize. The photographs felt authentic because they were imperfect. Someone blinked. Someone laughed too hard. Someone accidentally stepped into the frame. They looked like real memories, except they belonged to a version of me that had disappeared. I placed the album back on the shelf and opened a small plastic container labeled home. Inside were utility bills, insurance paperwork, grocery receipts, and handwritten shopping lists from 7 years earlier. Every document carried my name and Emily's name. Every signature belonged to me. Every receipt reflected purchases I had absolutely no memory of making. My breathing became shallow. Why would anyone hide all of this? I whispered. Grace finally stepped closer. Because this room was never meant to erase your past. She looked around at the shelves with quiet sadness. It was meant to protect it until you were ready to face it again. I turned toward the desk and carefully removed the gray cloth. Beneath it sat a small laptop connected to a charger, as though someone expected it to be used at any moment. A yellow sticky note rested on the keyboard. The handwriting matched every label in the room. It contained only one sentence. "Ethan, if you are finally here, please do not judge Emily until you hear me explain everything myself." My hands remained frozen above the laptop for several seconds. I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent light inside the storage unit, the distant sound of a rolling door somewhere else in the building, and my own breathing growing steadily heavier. Everything inside that room had one purpose. It had been arranged for me. Not for an investigator, not for a lawyer, not for a stranger. For me. I slowly lifted the screen. The battery had long since died, but the charging cable was already plugged into the wall. After a few moments, the display flickered to life. There was no password. The desktop contained only a single folder titled, "Start Here, Ethan." I looked toward Grace. She stood quietly beside the entrance with tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "I have never watched this," she whispered. Emily asked me to promise that the first person to see it would always be you. I clicked the folder. Inside was one video file with a date from almost 7 years earlier. My finger hovered over the mouse before I finally pressed play. The screen faded in to reveal a man sitting in a familiar chair. It took only a heartbeat to realize I was looking at myself. My hair was slightly longer, my face looked thinner, and there were faint lines of exhaustion around my eyes, but it was unquestionably me. I looked directly into the camera with an expression I had never seen before. Calm, certain, almost peaceful. "If you are watching this," the man on the screen began, "then the plan worked exactly the way I hoped it would." I instinctively leaned closer. "I know this feels impossible, Ethan, but I need you to trust me because I am you. Right now you probably believe someone has lied to you. The truth is much stranger. No one stole your memories. You asked us to protect them." My chest tightened. The man on the screen took a slow breath before continuing. 6 years ago, I was overwhelmed by grief, fear, and guilt after a series of events that left me unable to move forward. I stopped sleeping. I stopped living. I pushed away everyone who loved me, especially Emily. My doctors believed that an intensive treatment program combined with temporary memory separation might give me the chance to rebuild a healthy life. They warned me that I might permanently lose access to part of my past. I signed every document anyway. I stared at the screen in disbelief. This room exists because I wanted the truth preserved, even if I could not carry it every day. I asked Emily to help me build a new beginning instead of forcing me to relive every painful memory before I was ready. I also asked Grace to become the guardian of everything we left behind. I slowly turned toward Grace. She lowered her eyes without saying a word. The man on the screen smiled gently. "If you are angry, please do not blame Emily. She argued against my decision until the very last day. She believed I deserved every memory, no matter how painful. I was the one who convinced her that loving someone sometimes means accepting the choice they make for themselves." Tears filled my eyes before I realized they had begun to fall. Every impossible question that had consumed me since the airport suddenly shifted into something even more unsettling. Emily had not erased my past to deceive me. According to the man on the screen, she had spent years protecting a decision I had made myself. Then the recording reached its final sentence before fading to black. "There is one truth I could never record because you have to discover it with your own eyes. When you leave this room, ask Emily about the lake house. That is where the real story begins." The screen went dark, but I remained seated in front of the laptop as though another message might appear if I waited long enough. My reflection stared back at me from the black display, and for the first time in my life, I questioned whether I truly knew the man looking back. Every certainty I had relied on for years had quietly unraveled inside a storage unit I did not remember renting. I wiped my eyes and slowly stood. Grace had not moved from the doorway. She looked relieved that the truth was finally unfolding, yet there was still a sadness in her expression that I could not understand. "Why did he say the real story begins at the lake house?" I asked. Grace took a slow breath. "Because he believed seeing it again would matter more than hearing someone describe it." "Then tell me where it is." She hesitated before reaching into one of the labeled storage bins. She carefully removed a large manila envelope with my name written across the front. Inside were property documents, insurance papers, and a warranty booklet for a small cabin located on the eastern shore of Lake Chelan. My eyes immediately stopped on the deed. Owners, Ethan Walker and Emily Walker. Purchase date, 7 years earlier. I stared at the address in disbelief. "I have never been there," I whispered. Grace gently shook her head. "You have, many times." I turned another page and found utility statements showing regular electricity usage every month. The cabin had never been abandoned. Someone had continued visiting it. "Emily has been going there," I said quietly. It was not a question. Grace nodded. "She never stopped." My heart sank. Without telling me, she believed she was protecting the promise you asked her to keep. I leaned against the desk, trying to process another impossible discovery. Every few weeks, Emily had mentioned visiting friends, attending conferences, or spending weekends with her parents. I had never questioned her explanations because I trusted her completely. Now I realized she had probably been driving to a place that legally belonged to both of us, while I lived only a few hours away, without remembering it even existed. I looked back into the envelope and found something else tucked beneath the property records. It was a folded road map with one route highlighted in blue ink from our home in Seattle to the cabin. Across the top, someone had written, "If you ever forget the way, follow this road one more time." The handwriting belonged to the older version of myself from the video. My phone suddenly vibrated again. Emily's name filled the screen. I answered after only one ring. "Hi," I said softly. There was a brief silence before she spoke. "You sound tired. Are you almost home?" I closed my eyes. "Emily, have you ever been to Lake Chelan this year?" The silence on the other end became so complete that I wondered if the call had disconnected. When she finally answered, her voice had changed completely. The warmth was still there, but it was now joined by quiet fear. "Who told you about that place?" she whispered. I looked across the room at Grace. She lowered her eyes, understanding that the moment she had waited years for had finally arrived. "Emily," I said carefully, "I found the storage room." I heard her inhale sharply. Then, to my complete surprise, she did not deny anything. She did not become angry. She did not accuse me of misunderstanding. Instead, I heard the unmistakable sound of her crying. Very softly. "I tried so hard to keep my promise," she said through trembling breaths. "Please, before you decide what you think of me, come to the cabin tomorrow morning. There is one thing I could never bring myself to move, and once you see it, you will finally understand why I could never tell you the whole truth myself." The drive to Lake Chelan began before sunrise. Grace followed me for the first hour before pulling alongside my truck at a quiet gas station just outside Wenatchee. She stepped out carrying 2 cups of coffee and handed one to me without saying a word. We stood there beneath the cool morning sky, watching the first light spill over the distant hills. "You do not have to come any farther," I told her. She smiled gently and shook her head. "No, this is where my promise ends." I frowned. "You are not coming?" "Emily asked me to protect the truth until you reach the cabin. After that, it belongs to the 2 of you." She hesitated before adding, "Please remember one thing. Neither of you spent the last 6 years trying to deceive the other. You were both trying to protect the same person." Before I could respond, she quietly returned to her car and drove away. I watched her disappear down the highway before continuing alone toward the address printed on the property deed. Less than an hour later, I turned onto a narrow road lined with towering pine trees. The lake appeared through the branches, calm enough to reflect the pale morning sky like polished glass. At the end of the gravel driveway stood a modest cedar cabin with a wide porch facing the water. It looked strangely familiar, not because I consciously remembered it, but because every corner stirred a feeling I could not explain. Emily was already waiting outside. She wore a light gray sweater, faded blue jeans, and the same gentle expression that had welcomed me home after hundreds of ordinary workdays. The only difference was the sadness in her eyes. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she walked toward me and stopped only a few feet away. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. I searched her face, hoping to find anger, guilt, or fear. Instead, I saw only exhaustion, though she had been carrying a weight far heavier than either of us realized. "Why did you never tell me?" I asked quietly. Tears gathered in her eyes almost immediately. "Because every time I tried, you were finally smiling again." She looked toward the cabin. "I could not bear the thought of taking that away from you." She reached into her pocket and removed a small key that matched the brass finish of the locks inside the cabin. We entered together. The rooms were warm, carefully maintained, and filled with furniture that looked lived in rather than abandoned. Family photographs covered the shelves. Books lined the walls. A knitted blanket rested neatly across the couch. It felt less like a vacation home and more like a life paused in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Emily quietly led me down a short hallway and stopped in front of a closed door. Her hand rested on the doorknob, but she did not open it immediately. "This is the only room I never changed," she said softly. "Everything else moved forward. This stayed exactly as you left it." She opened the door. Sunlight poured through a single window onto a small writing desk facing the lake. The shelves were filled with journals, framed photographs, and souvenirs from trips I could not remember taking. On the desk sat a simple glass jar containing dozens of folded handwritten notes. Beside it rested another envelope addressed in my own handwriting. Emily picked it up with trembling hands before placing it gently in front of me. "Every time you had a good day," she whispered. "I wrote it down because you asked me to." You said that if your memories never returned, you wanted proof that your new life had still been worth living. My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope from the desk. The handwriting belonged to me. There was no doubt anymore. Every letter carried the same small imperfections that appeared in my signature on old financial documents and birthday cards Emily had saved over the years. I slowly unfolded the single sheet inside. Ethan, if this letter ever reaches you, then it means you survived the hardest decision we ever made. I hope you are smiling again. If you are, then every sacrifice was worth it. Please do not waste time trying to become me again. Become whoever you are now. I lowered the paper and looked toward Emily. Tears quietly rolled down her face, but she made no effort to hide them. You read that letter once every year, she whispered. You always hoped you would never actually need it. My eyes drifted toward the glass jar filled with folded notes. I opened it and removed one at random. Today you laughed because you burned the pancakes again and insisted they tasted better that way. I smiled without realizing it. Emily let out a quiet laugh through her tears. That really happened, she said. I unfolded another note. Today you spent 3 hours teaching our neighbor's little boy how to skip stones across the lake. You said watching someone discover something simple was enough to make the whole weekend worth it. Then another. Today you danced with me in the kitchen while the power was out because you said music was easier to hear when everything else became quiet. There were dozens more. Hundreds, perhaps. They were not records of extraordinary moments. They were ordinary days transformed into something precious because someone had cared enough to preserve them. I finally understood why Emily had continued returning to this cabin. She had never been hiding another life from me. She had been protecting every piece of the life we rebuilt together. I blamed you before I even knew the truth, I said softly. She gently shook her head. You had every reason to. I would have done the same. I stepped closer until only a few inches separated us. Why did you never stop believing I would come here? Emily looked toward the lake beyond the window. Because the man who recorded that video believed that one day you would be strong enough to choose the truth instead of being forced into it. She smiled through her tears. He knew you better than anyone because he was you. We walked outside together and sat on the old wooden dock overlooking the still water. The morning sun reflected across the lake exactly as it had in photographs I could not remember taking. For a long time neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to accuse, nothing left to defend, and nothing left to hide. I finally realized that memory and love were not the same thing. Memories could disappear through time, illness, or choices made in moments of unbearable pain. Love was different. Love quietly revealed itself through empty kitchen cabinets that suddenly made sense. Blueberry pancakes every Sunday morning, handwritten notes saved inside a glass jar, and 6 years of promises that two people had kept even when doing so broke their hearts. As we stood to leave the dock, I reached for Emily's hand. It felt familiar in a way no forgotten photograph ever could. I still could not remember the man I had once been, but for the first time I no longer believed that I had lost him. He had simply trusted the person I would eventually become. And as we drove away from the cabin together, leaving nothing behind except the silence of the lake and a room full of preserved memories, I understood that my greatest secret had never been hidden inside a storage unit or an old letter. It had been waiting in the life I was already living, patiently reminding me that sometimes the bravest thing a person can remember is not the past, but the choice to love the present.